Hey guys, welcome to another freshly squeezed samples tutorial. This is your host John Gran, and today I'm going to be showing you how to mix a song in under 30 minutes. If you recognize this project file, you're not going crazy because this is the project file that we used for our last video, how to produce a progressive house song in under an hour. Now with today's method, I'm going to show you a simple trick that you can use to mix your tracks faster. Now, I will say, I highly recommend you always have somebody else mix your tracks, only because what that does is it allows you to have more perspective and it gives somebody else the opportunity to give you constructive feedback. Now, if you can't afford a mixing engineer, then hopefully this video will give you some useful tips and tricks on how to mix your own tracks. So, the first thing I wanted to show you is I've created what's called mix groups, and I've created 4 of them. One for the kick and bass, one for the synthesizers and all the other instruments, one for the effects, and then one for the drum percussion. Now what this does is we've essentially routed each one of these different groups to their respective locations. So in this case, I routed the kick to this mix A, kick and bass, which is this guy down here. Then what I've done is I've routed our basses as well to mix A, where the kick and bass reside. And then I've added all the synths and everything else to mix B. And what that does is it gives us the flexibility to work with each one of these mix groups without having to worry too much about every single individual element. A lot of times when we're mixing, we can get hung up on the smallest details and then start losing focus of our track. With this method, at least, we can focus on each group individually and be able to give our ears some time to rest and to focus and to listen on what each part of the track is doing. So let's go ahead and listen to the track before we get started. I'm not going to play the whole entire thing, but I am going to start it from, say, from here and then into the final drop. Alright, now that we've given our track a bit of a listen, let's go ahead and open up this little tool that I love to use called Metric AB. Metric AB is an auditioning utility tool, and what it lets us do is it lets us listen to a reference track in relation to our original track. So let's go ahead and listen to what that sounds like. So as you can see right there, A is our stream track or our DAW track, and B is our reference track. Now, one of the first things I noticed is that the loudness is super loud on the reference track because it's been mixed and mastered. So let's go ahead and bring that volume down with gain matching. So what we do in Metric AB is we simply click on match. And as it says here, click to match the loudness of the reference track to A, and then that way you'll be able to have a better evaluation. Great, and that's helped us out a lot because now we can listen to the reference track and not worry about the volume loudness, which is something that a lot of times we can get stuck on. So, a couple other quick tips. Metric AB has a very useful utility that lets us essentially just listen to the subs, the low mids, the highs, and everything else that we need to. So let's go ahead and listen to the sub bass real quick between our track and the reference track. So one of the first things I noticed is that the sub bass on my track is lacking a little bit of energy, could even be dB volume. So let's go ahead and look and see exactly where the difference is. So it looks like the sub bass on the reference track is peaking at about minus 9.5 dB. And then let's look at where the sub bass is on this track. It looks like on this track it's at minus 12. So the sub basses could come up a tad bit. So let's go ahead and bring up the sub basses by 2 dB. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna bring up a simple utility tool. And this is gonna be our gain knob. And I'm just gonna go ahead and input 2 dB on the subs. And just to make sure that the subs are playing in the right frequency, let's just isolate them real quick in the track and kind of look at the frequency spectrum of the overall sub. I'm going to go ahead and pull up FabFilter Pro Q3, but you can use any EQ of your choosing. So I think one thing I notice here is on my sub bass, I can maybe bring this up to about 90, and that'll allow us to get a little bit more sub into the mix. As you can see here, there is a very hard low pass going on, which is great for limiting all of the other frequencies so that we can let the mid basses do their work over here. That's already bringing us in a lot more energy. Now let's listen to the track in reference. Now the two tracks are sounding very similar in the spectral frequency. One thing I want to point out too is that if you're working on a track that you're trying to get reference, you're trying to get the mix as close to your reference, it's always important to make sure that you have two songs that are in the same key. Now, it's not always required, but it does help you a lot because if you're trying to figure out where your bass is hitting in terms of a song that's in F major, then you also want your reference track to be in that same key so that you're making better decisions. Now, let's go ahead and go back into the full mix and compare to the reference. So off the bat, another thing that I notice is that my mid basses are very, very wide on the stereo spectrum. Now, one thing we can do is we can open up FabFilter Pro Q3 or any other EQ that has mid-side parallel processing or processing. And with FabFilter Pro Q3, there's a cool preset called Cut Low Side. And what this does is it essentially says that anything under 100 Hertz is going to be in the mid section or the mono section. And then anything above that is going to be placed into the stereo spectrum. So let's hear what that sounds like when I start playing with it. The further to the right, the more mono it gets. The further to the left, the more... the further to the right, yeah. The further to the left, the more stereo things become. Generally speaking, anywhere between the first and second octaves is where you want that to hit. We don't really want those low frequencies and low mid frequencies to have too much stereo, so we kind of let the top end of that kind of get the stereo information. So I think that's a pretty good spot to leave it at. Let's go ahead and listen to the track. Great, and I think that sounds pretty decent. Now, one thing is I am noticing that the kick is very low, or at least some of the energy is missing in comparison to our reference track. So let's go ahead and bring up the bass filter on this section here and kind of listen to how the kick and bass are playing together. So again, I've just selected this guy right here, and that's just going to let me audition the kick and bass together on those low frequencies to hear how the song is pumping. So what it sounds like to me is that my track is missing a little bit of sidechain. There's too much information coming in from the mid bass. So let's go ahead and see what our sidechain settings are. So this is my tool for sidechain that I'm using for this video, LFO tool. Let's just go ahead and listen to what we can do to get this kick and this bass kind of pumping a bit better together. And here all I'm doing is I'm just turning up the amount of volume control via the LFO. So the more to the right, the more sidechain it's going to sound. I'm going to bring that up a little bit more, and what that's doing is it's just letting us get a little bit more low end from the kick and a little bit more punch without it masking too much. And then let's go ahead and listen to the sub and the kick together. So that sidechain is sounding pretty good. I might give it just a little bit more so that the kick can kind of come in a little bit more. Then let's go ahead and look at the kick. I feel like the kick could use a little bit of a bump right around 50. So we're just gonna do a very small bump, 1.5, maybe get rid of some of this low end right here. See how that sounds. That kick and bass relationship is sounding a lot better. Now let's move on to the synthesizers and instruments. Let's listen to how that's kind of pumping with the kick. Alright, so I think the first thing I noticed is that there is a little bit of unnecessary low end on the synths and instruments. So what we're going to do is we're just going to cut out a few of those frequencies. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. There's also a very high resonant peak right here that we don't need, so I'm just going to go ahead and filter that out. That's just going to allow us to get a little bit more headroom without having to worry about this really high-end frequency that isn't really doing anything. There's also a very strong frequency right here that I think we can kind of bring down a little bit. It's just a little too exaggerated for my taste, so I'm going to bring that down a tad. thing I'm noticing too is that we're missing a lot of energy from this area around 4K to 7K, so I'm just going to bump that up just a tiny bit. I don't think we need a whole lot. I'm just going to do like a 3 dB increase just to kind of bring out some of those richer high-end sounds. Let's go ahead and listen to our reference track. So I think in relation to the reference track, our track is very close. I think it still could use a little bit of a bump in this area. And this is the mid region between 800 Hertz and 4000. So let's analyze it a little bit further and see where we can make some improvements. And one of the key things to doing this is to start off with the reference track and start analyzing the EQ spectrum in relation to the reference track. It's always, whenever we're doing referencing, we always want to look first at the reference and then compare that with our track. And all we're doing here is just trying to make sure that the peaks are somewhat similar, and if there's anything that we're missing. We can always open this up a little bit to get more perspective. So it looks like at around 3.48 kilohertz is where we need to maybe do a small boost around the synths just to kind of bring a little bit more of that air out. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over and come back to my synthesizer bus and give this a little bit more boost around 3. And that's getting us one step closer. Now again, I don't think that your songs have to match a reference track exactly. It's really more of a reference point or a guiding point. So don't get too hung up on making sure that every single frequency is identical. The key is to sort of see certain patterns that you're noticing with your reference track and with your own track. And there's a really cool tool and a technique that I can show you in another video using EQ matching, but we're not going to get into that in this video because this is really more about trying to figure out a quick workflow to be able to get your mixes to a place where you can kind of send them to other people for demos or to record labels or whatever. So let's go ahead and listen to where our track is at in these other sections. So what I've done right there is I just compared my intro or bass section to the drop, and one thing I noticed is that there is a big loss in the low end. So let's see what that is. So let's go ahead and open up our sub bass and see what is happening. So it looks like on the sub basses in this section we got these dotted pattern notes, and then let's look at the sub bass in this section, and there it is. The sub bass in this section has legato notes, meaning that the notes are extended, and then in this section the bass notes are choppy. So how do we fix that? Well, there's a really easy trick in Ableton to do that, and all you gotta do is just select all the notes, click legato, and now our bass notes are gonna have just that sort of extended feel that you kind of want for a sub bass in this scenario. So let's go ahead and turn those all into legato mode, and let's listen to how it sounds now. Big difference right there, right? So all we did really was just play around with some of the midis and just making sure that they're a little bit more extended for the sub bass. Pretty simple and quick fix. Let's go ahead and listen to some of our effects and see how they are sounding. I'm going to open up another FabFilter Pro Q3 just to kind of get an idea of what the frequency spectrum looks like. So the first thing I'm noticing is that there's a lot of buildup there of low end. So as you can see here, we can take some of that out. There's also this very piercing note here that we can maybe turn down a little bit. I'm going to turn off the freeze. Then let's go to some other sections and see what it's sounding like. Overall, not a whole lot of problems with the effects, so I'm not going to do a whole lot of work to them because they honestly sound fine to me. Main thing we did was just take out some of the lows that we didn't need. There was just like this really giant curve over here going from here to here that we didn't need. So now let's move on to the drum percussions and see if there's anything that we need to do to kind of bring out some of the energy in this track. So the only thing I'm noticing is that one percussion is really loud, so let's just bring it down a tad. I believe it's this guy. Yeah. So let's just bring that down by maybe -4, just to kind of control it a little bit. And let's see how it sounds in relation to the kick and bass. Now let's listen to our reference track to see where the energy resides in that track. So one of the first things I'm noticing is the percussion and the highs on my track are very loud. As you can see, the reference track has a nice little curve that's bending downwards. We can gain some headroom by also doing the same on our track. So for something like this, there's two ways we can go about it. One is we can add EQs to each one of these mixes wherever we know that those high frequencies are hitting, or the alternative is we can just go to the master and drop in an EQ anywhere and just maybe curve those frequencies just a tad bit. Now let's look and see how it's looking on metric AB. And there you go. We just solved that curve issue. Now, one thing to take note is that this track, the reference track, has a lot more happening on the high end than our track does. So what that means is that we shouldn't get too caught up with getting them to sound exactly the same, because a lot of times if you try to do too much on the high end, it'll make your track sound very tin canny and very small. So we only want to make subtle adjustments to that wherever we feel needed. One thing we can do is maybe widen the stereo field of the drums and percussion. So how do we do that? Well, there's another cool preset in FabFilter Pro Q3 that I like to use called the Boost the High Side. And remember how before we were cutting out the lows, now we're actually boosting the stereos or the highs. And the preset starts off pretty high at like 60 dB, but I'm going to start at 1 and just kind of slowly bring it up from there and see where it starts sounding a bit more clear and not too overbearing. It's a very subtle effect, but all it's doing is it's giving us just a little bit more energy on the high end. So I'm going to keep it at around 4 dB just for the percussion. Here's with it off. I think right around there is a good starting point for that. I'm not going to get too caught up on the stereo imaging, since that's an area where you can definitely lose a lot of time. But one of the first things that I want to do before we finish off is I want to make sure that my subs are a little bit more mono. So let's just go ahead and add a low side cut. And then let's go ahead and maybe reduce a little bit of the highs on the bass. So in this case, we're going to go to the mid basses. We're not going to actually process the group because we don't want to affect the kick. So just bring that a little bit to about -3 on that section. Kind of filter out some of the highs just a tad bit. On this mid bass, we can also get rid of some of this low end. Since this is going to be done by the sub bass, we don't really need a whole lot of this on the mid bass. I don't know if you can hear it, but the kick just sounds a lot more open and wide now after just doing a couple of little tweaks to the mid basses. Just sounds a lot more full. The last thing I want to look at is the sends, and let's just go ahead and listen to what they sound like because these are really important to mix in as well. Whenever you have really long reverbs like that, I think it's always good to kind of just tone them down a little bit in the mid-range. So wherever you see it sort of peaking too much in this region, I don't know, anywhere between 500 to 2000, just kind of bring those down a little bit. It'll make your synth stand out more, but it'll still give you that atmospheric effect. Let's listen to see if we have any echoes or delays going on. Just some room reverb. This to me sounds like it has too much low end, so I'm going to kind of remove a little bit of that out. Right around there is good. And that's just a reflection reverb. This is another reflection reverb. These guys are just giving us sort of more of that like dynamic space. I feel like these guys we can turn up the highs a little bit on the reverb. And that's sounding pretty good so far. Last thing I wanted to point out is on your master chain, or on your mix bus as some people call it, what I like to use is I like having this thing called the Swiss Army knife meter. This is a free Max for Live effect that you can download. But the reason why I like it is because I like to put it at the very beginning of my mix bus chain because it lets me see what my actual dBs are before any processing. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like on the drop, for instance. So my mix bus chain is hitting almost at -3, which is usually where mastering engineers want you to send their mixes at. Some mastering engineers want you to send it at -6 dB. But if your mastering engineer says, hey, like, you know, this track is way too loud or it's way too quiet, one quick trick that you can do is to bring a utility tool or a gain knob at the beginning of your chain, and you can slowly either turn it up or turn it down. Let's see what that sounds like. And right there we have the whole track at about -6, which is, you know, a pretty good starting point for delivery of a mix to a mastering engineer. As you can see, I don't really have any compression going on in the master or the mix bus. It's mainly just utility tools or gain knobs, EQs with mid-side processing, and then just a couple of other little goodies like the referencing tool that I highly recommend, which is Metric AB, invisible limiter, which I like to use whenever I want to have a personal mix so that I can listen to the mix in my car. Make sure you turn this off if you are going to send it to a mastering engineer, because at the end of the day, they should be the ones that are doing the limiting. And a lot of mastering engineers also prefer that you don't have any compression on your mix bus. If you were to add compression on your mix bus, because let's just say that, you know, you didn't have time to send this to an engineer or whatever, then one way that you can make sure that you're getting a little bit of compression on your mix is with this simple trick. So let's go ahead and bring in that utility tool again, and let's get this to a dB level that a mastering engineer would want it at, right? Which is anywhere from like -6 to -3 dB. So let's go ahead and check our Swiss Army meter. So that's a pretty good spot. Next thing we're going to do is just bring in a compressor. And we're going to put this at the very beginning of the chain. I'm going to just get rid of this EQ spectrum really quick because we don't need that. I'm actually going to use the glue compressor because for me on mix buses it sounds a little bit more transparent. Whenever I use compressors on a master, I typically prefer them to be a little bit more transparent and not so strong. And what this does is it basically lets us come up with a more clean, less colorful sound. So let's go ahead and set up this compressor. Some of my favorite settings are to set a ratio of 4, an attack of about 3. So we're kind of letting the compressor wait a little bit before it starts kicking in, and a release at about 0.1. And then all we're going to do from here is just work on making sure that we're getting about 2 to 3 dB of reduction. We don't really want this to pump too much. We just want this to kind of add a little bit of extra energy to the track, but not completely squashing it. So let's go ahead and just kind of play with the compressor for a little bit and see where we can get this track going. And right there we've set the threshold to about -14.3, and that's a good compression section, right? So we're only reducing the song by about 2 or 3 dB, or even 4. And then now we're just going to bring up the makeup volume, which is going to bring the track up in volume again after we've reduced some of the volume with compression. That right there just made the song a little bit more punchy. It's kind of gluing the elements together The glue compressor is like an SSL style compressor, which isn't necessarily the best one to use for electronic music, but if you're going for sort of like a transparent sound, not super squashed and compressed, it is a very good starting compressor for that. And another quick tip too is whenever you're compressing, you just want to make sure that whatever the makeup volume is, it's almost identical to the volume of your track before the compressor. So you don't want the compressor to make up way too much volume, right? You want it to get to the exact same state where it was at before the compressor was there. And that way you can really hear what it's doing as opposed to just cranking this up and hoping for the best, right? Well, at any rate, guys, I hope you guys appreciated this video. I had a lot of fun making it for you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe. I look forward to making more of these for you, and I'll see you next time.